Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to this wonderful setting. This is the third day of the conference, and this afternoon you will all have the possibility to enjoy a bit of more relaxed time, except of course for those of you who are probably jumping into a plane to go to another conference, another site, or to going back home. But I think it is going to be a well-deserved respite this afternoon after a very intense day yesterday. We asked a lot from you yesterday, and also from the coordinators. And everything I heard or I've seen during the day shows that you've not only accepted the challenge, but delivered tremendously, which is actually the best demonstration, if there were any need for it, of the level of importance you attach to those issues, your level of commitment to solve them, and your engagement in this process. It is extremely rewarding for us as Secretariat to see the level of discussions and the level of interactions that took place yesterday. We had 3 objectives with the second day, and this made for a very intense schedule. The first objective was to bring up to speed the people from the larger network on the work of the contact groups between Ottawa and Berlin, and particularly the remarkable result of this work, which is the operational approach documents. I think it was useful, but we heard a very interesting suggestion that in the next conference, it will be interesting to maybe have a more dedicated session for bringing everyone to a fuller understanding of the different elements, because the contributions were extremely rich, and a certain number of elements were important to explain in terms of why the balance had been reached at that particular point, what was discussed before, and what the result represents in terms of the reconciliation of interest. So we will think about how to integrate in the next conference, but also in the work in between, and in particular in the virtual program meetings, an update and a capacity to bring everybody fully up to speed. The second objective was actually the last session yesterday, and it was to allow you for a discussion and exchanges on your activities, the evolution of the environment, and the initiatives that you initiate, participate in, or follow, or are aware of. I think it was really appreciated. It was already something that was done in Ottawa, and it is actually resonating with the work that we're doing with the Global Status Report, which is to keep track of what is happening so that the communication part of the triptych that I mentioned on the first day is completely fulfilled. And of course, in between, the third element was to chart the way forward, to structure the work in the programs in the coming months after Berlin, by discussing and refining the documents and the draft work plans that we had circulated in the workbook. And here I want to emphasize something and highlight something regarding the word refining, because something emerged very organically in the discussions in all 3 groups in different ways, as will be presented by the coordinators. Meaning that refining meant sometimes looking at the wordings of bullet points that we had suggested as an input in the discussion, And sometimes the wording could be improved and changed, and that was the first dimension. But what was very interesting is that in each of the groups, to different levels, but in each of the groups, there was a real engagement on the substance and the identification of the subtopics and the elements that will inform the discussion further. And in as much as there is a need for the Secretariat to transmit and publish a certain number of elements as a result of this conference, what is extremely important is the collecting of this information, the input that is being given to feed into the work afterwards. This is an ongoing process. This is not the finalization of one declaration, something that is negotiated. This is a very important element, and I think everybody felt this way, and the contribution and the discussions were really intense in each of the three groups, which makes it extremely promising to look at what is going to happen afterwards. And again, before I give the floor to the coordinators, the insistence on the fact that this is an ongoing process is a very important element. It's a flexible, and we try to make it as agile as possible by identifying the topics that people really want to care about. We suggested 2 working groups, and this was intended, and this is intended, to make sure that we can kickstart the discussions on the things that were obviously the way forward. What is important is that you feel and you understand that this is an evolutionary process, it's a journey, and that if there are other topics that emerge that can deserve the setting up of what in IETF people call birds of a feather, or things that seed a more additional structure afterwards, this is absolutely the way the network is functioning. So, in conclusion, I want to thank you very much for the work that has been done yesterday, for the very strong message that came from the groups about the usefulness of the operational approaches document and the need and the benefit that all of us would get in socializing this in the larger circles. And in a certain way, you have the capacity, and we will be very happy as Secretariat to work with you in that regard, to advocate, to circulate this in your own circles, and to make sure that the work that has been conducted within the contact groups and within the network at large, for the benefit of all, is spread to the largest extent possible. So with that, thank you for being here this morning. I will give the floor to the coordinators, and maybe can I start with you, Maarten, to give the report in a certain way on the work that has been accomplished yesterday in the domains.
Thank you, Bertrand. Thank you for that. And I couldn't agree more with your last words, which is all the good work we do here. If we then subsequently leave it to the Secretariat to start doing something with it, it's a very small angle and spearhead. We're all here together to act upon what we say makes sense. So also in the domains jurisdiction group, the focus was on, so what does make sense for us? It's a very engaged group with a good participation of the industry in DNS who makes the system works, the industry who uses the DNS, a number of interested governments, a bit of civil society, some other colleagues from ICANN as well. And really the focus is on how we can counter abuse of the DNS beyond ICANN's mandate. ICANN's mandate, which is focused on the stability and security of the DNS, but there's more that the DNS industry needs to care about. So we agreed on a work program on more work to do, and what we see here is a reflection of the discussion on interoperability of norms. Actually, this looks as actors. Yeah, this is not, it says norms. This is the working group on actors. And basically we adopted the points that were already offered in our earlier work. These are in black. The notice components, the mechanisms, procedural due diligence. And we added some notes of, we really need to look into that. Relations with law enforcement, timing of responses, supporting evidence, emergency, clear go-to places for information, globally accepted standards for requested formats. A very practical example here is that part of the work of the DNS group so far was, so what does it take to have a good notification of abuse? And it came strongly forward in our discussion yesterday. This is something we need to take beyond this network. So see whether we can get it in standardization bodies, ISO or ITF, to say this is how you do a proper notification of harm. Next to the things that we already mentioned, also procedures for specific actors, the frameworks to identify where liability actually rests, the whole cost side, how do you make it affordable, would you indemnify players. We also added the very important note on, so what are actually the expectations of those parties that are taking part in this. So it's not only the practicalities, but also making very clear that people know what to expect. On norms, rightly indicated here, also we thought that much more was to be done, in particular on the thresholds justifying action, but also knowing what kind of action. And a strong proposal came up to do some mapping of, so what kind of abuse is there, and for instance also look into how are legislative responses at this moment formed, to find a kind of common denominator that would be interesting to know overall. Proportionality, a key issue, a keen look at severity and also on urgency of taking measures is key in that. So basically we're looking at a balance between what on one hand is affordable, scalable, on the other hand, so for the industry in terms of measures to take. On the other hand, what is also effective and sufficient from a user perspective, but also from a legal perspective. Make sure it's proportional, with a keen eye for severity and urgency as well, and necessary. In that, the key part is also, so who is to act? It's by far, if it comes down to the registry operator, so the holder of the after the domain, at that moment it's really the last resort. And mostly it would be more effectively to do it before then. So it's really about what can we do to create a better user experience by effectively handling abuse in the DNS as it is developing. We can build on a lot of good practice, and it's isolated practice or practice done by some of the actors in the field already. And it's really to learn together and to create tools that we can all use. So this extends to more of the industry in the clear understanding that players range from very large to very small. So from there, so there's a clear distinction of, just to summarize, what we look for is a clear distinction of the source of abuse, clear identification of who is to act, with the notion that there are steps in that, and if we cannot rely on some step, we may need to go to a next step. How to make it stay scalable and ensure due process and a good understanding of how that looks like. Practical things that we came up with is indeed, as mentioned, and again in summary, these go-to places. Where can the industry go for trusted and useful information, balanced information? We found this also to be necessary and useful for law enforcement agencies and the judiciary. There's cases known of judges making court orders that would not have led to effective solutions for the problems just because of poor understanding of how the system works. So having a go-to place where this information can be found is important. Good practice, for instance, in New Zealand is they have a go-to place, and we can learn from that again. And a go-to place in the end for users. Where can we have trusted information? There's a lot of fake news out there. How do we know where to go to? And how do we make sure that the information for dealing with abuse is clearly presented to users? So, and as I mentioned, the standards for notification, by bringing it to one of the global standard bodies, we take it out of our circles and make it more visible. And with that, I think that the last part we talked about is parties we miss in the network at this moment. And whereas in earlier sessions there were law enforcement officers present, and this was well appreciated, they were lacking today. And I think if we can bring them back in, and that's not only your responsibility as Secretariat, but that of all of us, that would be extremely useful. Because just like from the industry, we get very practical input like, it doesn't work like this, or we get these kind of requests for taking action. Similar things are happening, and is known by law enforcement. So what is the reality? Not what can happen in theory, but what is really happening. So law enforcement there, judiciary, or at least experience with judiciary system that is deeper than what was currently present, on one hand. So these are both in as parties to make sure they're well informed, as parties that should inform this process. Another group that came up and we hadn't discussed before is in particularly the anti-abuse actors that weren't here. I mean, we got some, we got MOOC, we got other actors that really keep track of abuse, that help fighting abuse. Yes, we had some experience in the room, but very little, and no active actors at this moment. And the CERT community. CERT community in two ways. One, emergencies relate to abuse as well. But the other thing is also there's procedures in the CERT community that may well be very adoptable for fighting abuse in the DNS industry. And very clear comparison is there on trust circles. Who do you trust for information? Who do you trust for notification, etc. And clear procedures. So with that, I think we have a lot of work to look for to do further together, and there's a clear interest and engagement to further this. So looking forward to the next steps.
Thank you.
Can we invite for anything more that I forgot to say? Or
Yes, you're right. We can do it now instead of doing it at the end of the three presentation. Absolutely. Any additional comment by people from the domains and jurisdiction program? Or was the report by the coordinator so perfect and exhaustive that it covered everything? In any case, if something comes back to mind afterwards, don't hesitate in the plenary. That's also part of the feedback we're looking for. And thank you very much for the suggestions regarding the engagement of additional actors. This is exactly the kind of thing that we want to do in bringing the network of the program more exhaustively and to include them in the contact groups afterwards. Thank you. If I may now give the floor to Wolfgang Schulz, who was the coordinator, is the coordinator for the Content and Jurisdiction Group program.
Thanks very much. First of all, I think it's important to say that we have an impressive variety of actors present. Civil society, very strong, states, regulators, companies, and other stakeholders. We had the Global South represented, but there's room for improvement there as well. That was noted. What I appreciated very much was a down-to-earth, goal-orientated atmosphere that we had. Many thanks to the group for that. It makes the life of a coordinator much easier, but that is a minor point, of course. It helps to focus, which is in the content group especially challenging, because there's always the risk that you want to do the whole thing. You want to design an order for platforms as a whole and say what is specific in terms of jurisdictional issues is always something we have to keep in mind in this group, and this focus was very, very good at this meeting yesterday, I would say. Generally, the participants expressed support for the work that is synthesized in the operational approaches document. It was good to see that there were a lot of references to this document when we debated, and people said, don't let us fall behind what has been achieved, which is already in the operational approaches document, and in general, I think there was great support and view of the methods suggested how to move forward. Referring to what Bertrand said before, that we have two ways to refine a document. We did both here. We tweaked the text a little bit to better reflect what the group felt was the thing that should be in the focus, but we also had extensive discussions about what we should discuss and what way we should discuss things under those headlines given there. And I think that was very fruitful, very helpful. If we look at the suggested working group A, you can see that we had discussions that are reflected here on the role of the user. We had a lot of debates on terms like notices and notifications and what might be a good neutral term to use here. But also not divert too much from what has been done before and has been reflected in the documents that are already there. There was a discussion about algorithmic decision making being a cross-cutting issue. Finally, we said we leave it here as one focus point, but it plays a role across the board, I would say. And again, coming back to the point I made at the beginning, we have to be cautious that we do not have the over-ambition to cover all things, but see how it interplays with jurisdictional problems here. There are overlaps, but the issue is much broader here. In terms of refinement, that is not so much tweaking the text, but is discussing what can be discussed under the headlines. We had extensive debates on a taxonomy on public authorities. We have not done that so far. What is a competent authority here? Also, which is of course tricky, do we need something like a taxonomy of states and how to deal with different states? That is very, very tricky, of course, but nevertheless it was mentioned several times, and so I think it should be something to be considered by the group working on those things. We had an extensive discussion about topic that is formats and components of transparency reporting. Finally, or the interim conclusion was not to put it here on this list because it's not really an actor-actor interface that we are discussing, but nevertheless we think that the group can make a difference when this issue arises, and we see that a lot of questions are asked in very different circumstances about what components and formats of transparency reporting should be. So that is one of the things that went on the cards as a specific issue, and I think post-Berlin we have to discuss how we include that. Should it be mandate of the working group A, or should we have a different instrument to deal with that? But I think that's important. Moving to B and the norms, again, we have this two categories. We talked about the text, and we talked about what we should discuss under the headlines. I will only mention some of the discussions we had. For example, on the point 2, the public authorities notices are based on community guidelines. There was some concern mentioned in the group that even if we put this as a bullet point on it, it might legitimize these kind of practices, which many in the room felt is something we should analyze very critically. Nevertheless, finally we said it is good for us to talk about that, to come out with a strong message if the working group feels that way as regards this point. So it's a good talking point, but it's a dangerous one, and I think we should highlight that. We talked a lot about the different types of regulation and moderation. We went back to the document saying what wording did we have there for the actions of the platforms, and came up with a wording that you can see here highlighted, because we felt that it is very much reflecting the language that is in the document. Additionally to the points that are here in the text, the need for transparency was mentioned when these kind of very complex hybrid mechanisms emerge, where you have a combination of private rules that govern moderation and state action here in this respect. The Audiovisual Media Services Directive was mentioned as an example by one in the room, saying that it's a very complex arrangement of regulations is suggested by this regulatory tool, and to have the necessary level of transparency here is a challenge, and we might contribute to this debate. We also talked extensively about the best way to make clear that when we talk about the international system of norms, that we do not overstate the case, cannot be harmonizing the regulation. We came up with the term coherence as a very generic term that does not trigger the imagination of a completely harmonized international system, which is neither possible nor really something we want in this world. That's why we put here coherence and based on human rights to emphasize that. But there was a lot of debate on that mentioning human rights does not always help the case, because sometimes that does not really reflect the debate in the human rights community, and so you have to be very careful how you frame that, how you integrate the wording of human rights. But that's what we came up with. Finally, I think if I read the room correctly, then this structure is a very good basis to move forward, and I think there is a lot of commitment, and was a lot of commitment in the room to work with this structure the next 2 years, but nevertheless we feel that some flexibility has to be built in the process, because we cannot foresee what the thing is in the next 1 year or 1.5, or maybe not even the next 2 months. For that, 2 things are important. One is we have to very carefully analyze what is on the cards. A lot of points were put on the cards as additional ideas. I just mentioned the transparency of reporting issue, but there are many more. I think that's one of the challenges the Secretariat and we have after Berlin to take note of that, analyze that, group that, and play it back to the community to see how we deal with that and how we prioritize that. The second one is that I personally believe that it's helpful to have a look at the global status report in terms of how we move forward. I, again personally, that's not reflecting what has been mentioned yesterday, was very struck by the notion of many experts in this report that they feel that the institutional setting is not sufficient to deal with the problems at hand. I think we have to take that very seriously and have to think what that actually means and what our role as Internet and Jurisdiction Network as a whole, but the content group as well, can be when people actually see a need for improvement at this point. So I leave it with this and thank the group again very much for the inspiring day yesterday.
Thank you very much, Wolfgang. Any additional comment from the content and jurisdiction session yesterday? Yes, Steve.
Thank you, Wolfgang. Steve Del Bianco with NetChoice. Governments such as Germany, UK, and others are already regulating the modalities of moderation. That's an opportunity to accelerate some of what we're doing and present it, offer it as a safe harbor, a deemed compliance, a set of practices. The regulator in Germany might look at and say, yes, this seems to satisfy what NetzDG had in mind. It's an opportunity we shouldn't miss. The UK's white paper on moderation is going to turn into legislation probably this time next year. So that is another opportunity to present the best practices that we have and map them into what the law will articulate. I realize that might be a slightly different pace than you might have in mind for the next iteration, but it's an opportunity I encourage you not to miss. Thank you.
Any other comment? Well, in that regard, Steve, thank you very much, because this is one of the elements that we wanted to highlight, which is that basically the year ahead of us, irrespective of our own rhythm, has a certain number of rendezvous points. There are things that are under discussion. There are processes, particularly in parliaments, because Martin was mentioning the community of the judiciary, which is one community that is actually difficult to reach. But what is happening in different governments or in parliaments will be on the agenda in 2020, and it is absolutely clear, and it has been mentioned in some of the groups, and I'm sure that Robert will mention it as well, that part of the socializing of the existing result of the operational approaches, but also the ongoing work in each of the programs into those processes is an extremely important task ahead of us. And as was said before, it is not only the Secretariat, but it's the Secretariat with the help of the rest of the community that will circulate those things. So the sort of back and forth, and I hope in a certain way, that it doesn't function only in one, and I'm thinking out loud here, as you all know I do. It is not only what the network circulates and spreads, it's also, I hope, that people outside in the larger processes will think about finding this as a resource and saying we are in the process of developing a particular procedure. Either it's a single parliamentarian or it is the head of a committee that is managing things, that they will look at the work that has already been done and that they will be able to test ideas or to have a feedback on what the proposals are. So this sort of respiration, we have worked to produce things within the groups until now, and this is the remarkable result of the reconciliation of the different perspectives. I think the period ahead of us is not to produce something by 2021 as one document, not at all. It's about working on an ongoing basis and having this respiration between what is being brought in and what is being projected out, and also to hope that the actors outside see this as a major resource and as a major space for discussion. One point I cannot resist to highlight, Wolfgang is mentioning the discussions about the challenges of even mentioning a title, because for some actors it may seem like an endorsement of a practice that actually on the substance they don't want to see adopted. And it is something that we've been not struggling but trying to pay a lot of attention to, because if you don't put the title or put the heading, then the topic is not addressed and nobody has the opportunity to say that actually this is something that should not be done in their view. But if you put the title, yes, it can be circulated and people say, this is a practice that is recommended. And so this is something that is a very interesting dynamic in the discussions. And I think finding the right balance has been achieved so far, and it will continue to be a challenge. But thank you for the comment. And I like the expression of regulating the modalities of moderation. I think it's it's an interesting wording that will stay. Can I now turn to Robert Young, who was the coordinator and is the coordinator for the third group program on data and jurisdiction.
Well, thank you very much, Bertrand. Maybe just before we put the document up, I had some preliminary comments, and then we can look at the text. Can you take it down?
Yeah. No, it's there to stay.
Wrong format.
That's
Yes.
Thanks. It's not that I want to be on camera. I just wanted to give you a bit of a flavor of our discussions before going to the text. The first thing I think I'd say is we met in this room in the data group, and it was an inspiring environment, inspiring setting for what became quite inspiring and inspired discussions. Like the other groups, we had good, diverse representation from all the stakeholder groups. But the other thing I wanted to mention is also a healthy mix of veterans of these discussions and new voices, new faces in the room. And that, I think, is a very positive trend that I wanted to report back to you on, and is part of what will expand the influence of our work, which I think is, as we all know, a shared objective. I think right off the top, one of the things I wanted to highlight is that many of the suggestions and comments from the group were focused on outreach. They were focused on taking the ideas compiled in the operational approaches document out to the broader community, not in 2 years, not in 1 year, but starting this year, right away. Making the ideas in the operational approaches document known to stakeholders now so they can start making use of it. The issues are so important. I think we all feel that things are speeding up. We can't afford to wait. So I think that was one of the key messages, and it sounds like that was the case in other groups as well. But for our group, that was one of the sort of top level messages. We had a lot of great ideas coming forth that I would say were inspired by the work plan document, and you'll see them in a minute. There was a really interesting sort of dynamic of wanting to build on the work plan, build on the work done in the operational approaches document, but not be stuck on it, not to be in an endless loop of discussion where we'd keep relitigating some of the same issues. So there was a bit of a challenge to say, what do we do with the work plan? The wrong approach could be counterproductive in a couple of sentences. One, as I said, is simply that we'd get a larger group together but relitigate the same issues and not really be going forward. And we don't want to lose that time. The other was if we made a work plan that seemed to call into question or revisit a lot of what was in the operational approaches document, that might undercut the, if you like, the ready-to-serve nature of the work that's been done so far. So that was a bit of a dilemma about how we would capture that in the work plan. But I think the positive way to look at it, I think, is that we have momentum, and there is a shared vision, a shared wish to ensure that momentum is maintained. A certain portion of our exchanges, in both in the small groups and the plenary, I'll tell you candidly, we're not easily reduced to sentences that could go into a work plan. Because the ideas were a little bit, in some cases, bigger than the work plan and broader. And a lot of the ideas were questions. There were questions about how do we solve this, how do we fix this, how do we build on that. So that was very healthy, challenging as a moderator, but ultimately very productive. So maybe now we can put the document up on the screen. In some ways, we gave more priority to collecting ideas. It can be bigger, I think, because there are a lot of words there. Great. We really tried to focus more on collecting all of the ideas rather than try to reconcile all of them. The reason that it's in so many different colors is because we had so many different perspectives and ideas being brought forward, which we saw as very healthy and dare I say it, a sort of organic sort of process and discussion. So with the Secretariat, we've already started last night, and right after this session, we'll go back to somewhere where there's coffee and complete some editing and revising to try and capture these ideas in a practical, useful work plan. But I think I wanted to share with you for this page, and you can maybe go over the page for is it me who's controlling it? I wish I'd known. You'll see different colors coming up here, and here is Working Group B, where there was some new ideas added, new perspectives added throughout in the document, again in different colors. So we'll finish revising that and editing it so that there's a deliverable work plan in the next really few hours or days. But I wanted to share that with you as it is so you can see how active our discussions were. Is it also possible if I click to get the next document? I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that we also we can't pull it up. Okay, we had another document which was other considerations, and that document became very long because a lot of the ideas didn't necessarily fit in the work plan, but ideas like some questions about the scope, what sort of data we are talking about, some very fundamental important questions were identified. And so we captured those in writing, and that will be made available to the data group going forward and the working groups so that they can benefit from the discussions in this room yesterday. So I also wanted to mention, in reporting on the session, the last part of it, which was also very useful. I got home last night and was thinking how heavy my briefcase was, and it was because as I unloaded it, we had a very large stack of pieces of cardboard where people had written their ideas. So I was pretty sure the group would have been exhausted from our discussions by 5:30 or so, but I received a large stack of those cards with ideas on them. So as Wolfgang was just saying, we'll have to integrate those as well in the coming days. Let's give the Secretariat a few days to rest, but starting next week, we'll start capturing those as well, because that will be useful for the work going forward. And I also wanted to mention and thank, it was very, I think, well coordinated, choreographed, to have at the end of the day yesterday, certainly in our group, the presentations on developments and activities. And I want to thank here our colleagues Alexander Seger from the Council of Europe, Monica and Carl from the European institutions, Peter Swire from Georgia Tech, who gave us updates on the Budapest Convention, on the e-evidence proposals, on the Cloud Act, and on the initiative Peter is doing to better share information about all these developments. Finishing those was a reminder that there are processes happening right now and that we have to feed into those right now. It sort of, for me, underlined the relevance of the work and the need to move forward as quickly as we can. So I wanted to thank all of those folks. And I will just mention, I was chatting with Alexander this morning, after the Budapest parties meet this November, there's the famous Octopus conference where different stakeholders can meet. As we said in our group yesterday, it'd be important that many of us following the issues here will find it worthwhile and important to be at the Octopus Conference, where states parties to the Budapest Convention have a chance to meet and exchange ideas with other stakeholders. So it's another forum where we can be multiplying and leveraging the work that we're doing. So I wanted to finish with that and conclude, of course, by thanking all of the members of the group yesterday, the new members, the seasoned members. But I think we really succeeded in agreeing on the importance of maintaining the momentum, and there are a lot of good ideas to carry forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Robert. We have one comment from the back from Greg.
Hi, Greg Nojheim, Center for Democracy and Technology. One of the key insights that we had at the meeting was reflected in the document that Robert couldn't show. Robert, I just want to thank you for very ably moderating that session and for very ably summarizing it. The one thing that wasn't discussed in this group is that the document that we prepared focuses on sensitive data, content, and some traffic. And it was pointed out during the discussions that we hadn't accounted for oh my gosh, subscriber information, which is the bulk of the demands that providers receive from governments. And there was a sense that we probably need to have a work stream devoted to that. And I thought that was a very important insight, and I wouldn't want it to be lost in these discussions.
Thank you very much, Greg. This is a perfect, and this report by Robert is a perfect illustration of the fact that the day yesterday is mainly and was mainly about collecting as much input as possible to feed into the work afterwards. It is not, and this is not the methodology here, to do what is done in a lot of processes because of that's the way they work, which is to have very lengthy discussion and then have only one document in the end that is the end of it until the next cycles. This is about really collecting, and we will also, with the coordinators afterwards and on the basis of the cards that have been filled, really try to get as much substance as possible from the discussions, both to feed into the process, but also, as Greg mentioned, to see when there are things that are across the structures that we explore or we propose. There are even things that might be shared between the different programs, because there are similar elements regarding procedures for notification, for instance, or there can be elements regarding the degree of convergence in terms of international normative consistency. And so I really want to emphasize, and thank you very much to Robert and the other coordinators for having taken into account and allowed as much input as possible beyond the refining, the first dimension of refining of the elements of the work plan. And I want to take the opportunity to thank also the three people who actually assisted the coordinators yesterday, particularly Martin Waldman, who kindly came from the Canadian Embassy to here in Berlin. Ajit Francis was up there. I know he's there for the content session, and Xavier Guyot was here behind me for the domains session. So I think we can give the coordinators, the members, and everyone a great applause.